the forest was alive with whispers. Shadows stretched long across the uneven ground, curling around gnarled tree trunks like dark fingers. The wind carried a chill that nipped at bare skin and unsettled the heart. Somewhere deep within this untamed wilderness, a small figure moved carefully, balancing a fragile burden. The human Omega walked slowly, his arms wrapped protectively around a small, shivering pup. Its hind leg was crippled, twisted unnaturally, and each step it took seemed painful. The Omega whispered soft words, murmurs of comfort he could barely hear himself. He had walked this forest path many times, yet today the shadows seemed longer, the sounds sharper. Every rustle of leaves made him tense, every distant howl of wolves set his heart racing. Yet he did not falter. He could not. The pup depended on him. He had always been weak in the eyes of others. Villagers had whispered pointed fingers and sneered at him for being fragile, for being human, for daring to care for something so small and helpless in a world that revered strength. They did not see the courage it took to rise each day, to face the cold, to carry this tiny life on his back. They did not see the Omega's heart. Far above, perched on a craggy cliff, a shadow moved with an impossible grace. The Alpha King, ruler of the northern lands, watched. His eyes, sharp as obsidian, traced the movements of the small figure below. He had ridden these forests countless times, enforcing his rule, displaying his might, crushing threats before they could rise. He was untouchable, feared by all, yet something about this human caught his attention. The Omega had not seen him. He did not even notice the gleaming armor that reflected the weak sunlight through the canopy. The king's cloak swirled in the wind as he leaned forward, curious, something stirring deep within him that he had not felt for centuries. The pup yelped softly, struggling to keep up. The Omega knelt immediately, lifting the tiny creature into his arms. He inspected its leg carefully, rubbing it gently, whispering encouragement. Tears threatened to fall, but he swallowed them quickly. His life was hardship, yes, but he would not give in to despair. Not here. Not now. Suddenly, the ground trembled faintly under the king's approach. His horse's hooves barely made a sound, yet the human froze, sensing the weight of unseen eyes. The king did not move closer. He merely watched, hidden in shadow, as the Omega adjusted the pup and pressed on. Step by careful step. For the first time, the king felt something strange, admiration. Not for the human's strength, for there was very little of that, but for his courage, for his care, for his heart. It was a fragile, flickering flame in a world that valued power above all else. The forest narrowed into a path lined with thorned brambles. The pup whimpered, its small body trembling against the Omega's chest. He murmured soothing words, his voice soft, patient, full of love. He paused, searching for the shallowest trail, the path that would not tear the pup's leg further. Every step was deliberate, careful, as though the entire forest depended on his choices. The king's chest tightened. He had seen many humans before, seen some rise to greatness, and many more fall into despair, yet none had made him pause. None had stirred something inside him that was not fear, not desire for obedience, not the thrill of conquest. This Omega, he was different. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed suspended in the forest's strange, whispering calm. The Omega finally reached a small clearing, where a broken stone bridge crossed a narrow, swift river. The water looked cold, merciless, and the pup's small cries echoed across the forest. He hesitated. The bridge was unstable, the stones slick with moss, and one wrong step could send them tumbling into the freezing river below. His eyes darted nervously along the stones. The pup wriggled in his arms, fearful, yet trusting him completely. The king's eyes narrowed. A choice lay before him: intervene, reveal his presence, and risk shattering the human's independence. Or watch, silently, and hope the fragile creature would survive. A part of him ached, a strange, unfamiliar ache that he had long buried under armor, power, and centuries of solitude. The Omega began crossing the bridge. Step by cautious step, he placed his feet on the stones, gripping the pup tightly against his chest. The water roared below, threatening, merciless. His breath came in shallow gasps. One stone wobbled dangerously. He froze. The king's hand itched to reach out. He wanted to appear, to ensure the Omega's safety, yet he knew that to do so would change everything. He wanted to see how far this small human could go, how much courage he could summon. The pup yipped, struggling to maintain balance. The Omega's grip tightened. He whispered, "Almost there. Almost." His voice was calm, steady, though his heart raced with fear. He had never felt so alive, so terrified, so determined all at once. Finally, the last stone. He stepped off the bridge onto solid ground. Relief flooded him, his shoulders sagging slightly. The pup nestled against him, exhausted, trembling, yet alive. The Omega looked back at the bridge, at the rushing river, and whispered a quiet, heartfelt prayer of thanks. The king exhaled softly, his usual calm demeanor fractured. He had witnessed a bravery that no sword, no army, no throne could command. Something within him shifted. He saw not a weak human, but a spirit that refused to bow, a heart that loved despite the cruelty of the world. As the Omega continued down the path, unaware of the king's gaze, the king made a decision. He would not interfere overtly, not yet, but he would ensure no harm came to this human. No predator or rogue hunter would cross his path, even if it meant bending his kingdom's rules, even if it meant placing himself in rare, subtle risk. The Omega finally reached a small, secluded cottage at the edge of the woods. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. He set the pup down gently, checking its leg once more. It wagged its tail weakly, nuzzling him gratefully. He smiled faintly. Exhaustion etched on his face. Yet pride warmed him. Unseen from the high cliffs, the king watched. His mind churned with thoughts and emotions he had long considered extinguished. Loneliness, admiration, fascination. Perhaps something deeper, something dangerous to his pride and his rule. He did not move, did not reveal himself. Instead, he turned, his mind already plotting subtle ways to cross paths again. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The wind stilled, the shadows paused, and for a moment it felt as if the world itself recognized the fragile balance between strength and vulnerability, between power and compassion. The Omega lit a small lantern in his cottage, the warm glow spilling onto the path outside. He hummed softly, a quiet song that seemed to soothe both himself and the pup. Outside, the forest returned to its natural rhythm, unaware that a king had observed a human's bravery, a human's care, and had felt the stirrings of something forbidden, something transformative. Night fell fully, painting the forest in deep indigo. The pup curled in its blanket, the Omega sitting beside it, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids. And far away in his castle, the Alpha King lingered on the cliffs, the memory of the fragile human etched into his mind. Like a mark he could not erase, a single thought took root, dangerous and persistent. He is mine to watch, mine to protect, and perhaps mine to change. And with that, the forest whispered around him, hiding secrets, shadows, and the promise of encounters yet to come. The Omega, oblivious to the king's gaze, drifted into a sleep filled with dreams of warmth, safety, and the faintest flicker of hope. A hope that the world, even one ruled by fear, might yet hold kindness. The king's eyes glimmered in the dark. A storm was coming, both for the human and for himself, and neither could imagine how it would change the course of their lives forever. Days passed after the incident in the forest, but the Alpha King could not shake the image of the small human cradling his crippled pup. He found himself wandering the borders of the kingdom more often, disguised by shadow and distance, observing the Omega without being seen. The human's life seemed so ordinary, so fragile, and yet every act of care, every gentle movement, drew the king's attention as if a spell had been cast upon him. The Omega remained unaware of his observer. His days were filled with simple tasks, gathering herbs in the forest for medicine, tending to the pup, mending his modest cottage. He spoke little to neighbors, who dismissed him as insignificant. Even so, he faced every hardship with patience and quiet determination. Each morning, he would carry the pup to the edge of the forest to watch the sunlight dance through the leaves, humming softly as he did. One morning, a sharp cry split the air. The Omega froze, heart pounding. As a group of hunters emerged from the trees, they were strangers, clad in dark leather and carrying weapons. The pup whimpered, sensing danger. The Omega stepped forward instinctively, holding his arms out as if he could shield the tiny creature with his own body. The hunters laughed, cruel and mocking. "Look at this weak human," one said, "carrying that crippled pup like it matters. Give it to us. We'll dispose of it quickly." The Omega's hands tightened around the pup. He would not yield. He could not. His voice trembled but carried a surprising firmness. "Leave us alone," he said. "You have no right." The hunters advanced, cruel smiles twisting their faces. The pup cried softly in the Omega's arms. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but he remembered the king's presence, though he did not know it yet. Somehow, he felt that someone powerful was watching, guiding him, waiting for this moment. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the clearing. The hunters looked up in alarm. From the trees emerged a figure taller and broader than any man they had ever seen. His armor glinted in the sunlight, though his movements were silent and precise. The Alpha King had arrived. The hunters froze, fear immediately replacing cruelty. This was the man who ruled with iron will, whose name alone commanded obedience across the lands. None dared challenge him. Yet today, he did not speak. He did not raise his sword immediately. He simply watched, assessing. The Omega stared in awe and confusion. He did not understand how this powerful being had appeared, nor why, and the king's gaze rested on him with an intensity that was almost painful. Something about the human's bravery, his vulnerability, and the fierce care for the pup unsettled the king more than any enemy ever had. The hunters stammered, backing away, and then one dared to step forward. We didn't mean—" The king's voice cut through the air, low and commanding. "Leave! Now!" The hunters fled without another word, tripping over roots, stumbling through the underbrush. The forest returned to silence, save for the pup's soft whimpers and the Omega's quickened breath. The king approached slowly. His presence was overwhelming, like a wave of power pressing against the fragile calm of the human. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, his voice softer now, yet still carrying authority. The Omega hesitated. He had expected threats, danger, maybe even death, but not this. The king, standing so close, watching him with eyes that seemed to see straight through his heart. I'm fine," he said, his voice small, uncertain. The pup wriggled in his arms, and the king's attention shifted briefly to the creature. His expression softened in a way that few had ever seen. He knelt slightly, careful not to startle them. "And the pup?" The Omega's shoulders sagged with relief. Safe, for now. He looked up at the king, meeting his gaze with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Thank you, if you saved us. The king nodded. You are brave, he said, his tone almost reverent. Few would face such danger without faltering, and yet you risk your life for something so small, so fragile. He paused, shaking his head slightly as if he could not comprehend the weight of the human's heart. The Omega lowered his head, embarrassed by the attention. He had lived all his life in the shadow of others' judgment. To hear praise from someone so powerful felt strange, almost unbearable. I have no choice, he murmured. I cannot leave him. He depends on me. The king's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the cold, untouchable armor around his heart seemed to crack. No, he said quietly. It is more than that. You care. You protect. You love. That is a strength even I cannot claim. The Omega's pulse quickened. He did not fully understand the meaning behind the words, but they stirred something deep within him. A warmth, a hope, a strange sense that perhaps he was seen, not as weak, not as human, but as someone who mattered. The king straightened. You must be careful. There are dangers in these forests beyond hunters, creatures and forces you cannot imagine. You cannot face them alone. I can manage, the Omega said, trying to sound confident. But he knew the truth. There were nights when he feared even leaving his cottage, when the weight of responsibility for the pup pressed so heavily on him that he wondered if he could survive another day. The king studied him silently, then spoke again. No, not alone. I will see to it that no harm comes to you, or to him. The Omega blinked, confused. You would do that? The king's eyes held a promise, dangerous and undeniable. I will. After a long moment, he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving the Omega staring after him. The silence of the forest returned, but the air itself seemed charged with the memory of the king's presence. The Omega sank to his knees beside the pup, holding it tightly, feeling a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. Who was this man who could appear like shadow and vanish like wind? And why did he care? That night, the Omega tended to the pup by the glow of a small fire. He hummed a quiet tune, trying to soothe both the creature and himself. Outside, the forest was still, but he could not shake the feeling of eyes upon him, watching from unseen places. He told himself it was only the wind, the rustle of leaves, the normal sounds of the wild. Yet deep down, he could not ignore the sense that his life had changed, that someone powerful had noticed him in a way no one else ever had. Far away, in the towering halls of his castle, the Alpha King could not sleep. He replayed the day over and over in his mind. The Omega's steady hands, the gentle voice, the way he held the pup despite danger. He had seen many humans in his life, some brave, some clever, some strong, but none like this. None who wielded vulnerability as a weapon, none who could command compassion so fully. A small thought crept into his mind, insistent and dangerous. He is mine to watch, perhaps mine to guide, perhaps mine to change. The king's advisor entered silently, bowing. You have patrolled the borders again, my lord. Shall we? No, the king interrupted, his voice firm. Leave me. Some matters are personal. The advisor hesitated, sensing the unusual intensity in the king's gaze, then bowed again and left. The king walked to the window, staring out at the darkened forest. The image of the Omega and his pup, fragile yet unyielding, burned in his mind. He did not fully understand what he felt, only that it was unlike anything he had ever known. Admiration, fascination, and something that might one day grow into something dangerous, something tender, something human. Meanwhile, the Omega slept fitfully, the pup nestled at his side. In his dreams, shadows of the forest swirled with light, carrying a sense of something vast and powerful, yet comforting. He did not know it yet, but the king's presence lingered in those woods, a silent guardian, and a force that would soon enter his life in ways he could not imagine. The forest held its breath, the night stretching endlessly, and somewhere between shadow and moonlight, fate began to weave its threads. The Omega's quiet bravery had caught the eye of a king, and neither of them could know how far the bond would grow, how dangerous the attention would be, or how deeply it would change both of their lives. And far above, on the cliffs overlooking the forest, the Alpha King lingered. His eyes glimmered with purpose. His thoughts were full of the small human who had dared to carry a fragile pup through perilous lands, and in the quiet of the night he made a silent vow. He would not let harm touch the Omega, not now, not ever. The Omega, asleep beside the pup, dreamed of safety, of warmth, and of a future he could not yet see. And the king, watching from afar, knew that he had begun a journey that would alter the course of his heart, of his kingdom, and of the fragile human who had unknowingly claimed a place in it. The days that followed the king's intervention passed uneasily. The forest seemed quieter, but the tension in the air never fully lifted. The Omega continued his routines, gathering herbs, tending to the pup, and maintaining his modest cottage. Yet he could not shake the feeling that eyes were upon him, watching, judging, waiting. Every rustle of leaves or distant howl made him glance over his shoulder, heart beating faster than it had in years. The Alpha King did not appear again, at least not openly. But the human could feel the presence of someone powerful, a force quietly shaping his world. Small things began to change. Threats that once lingered at the edges of the village disappeared. Stray wolves no longer prowled near the cottage. Even the wind seemed to move differently, as if a guardian invisible and immense was guiding him safely along the paths he had always walked alone. Yet peace was fleeting. One evening, as the Omega prepared a simple meal beside a fire, a chill ran through the air. The flames flickered as shadows shifted unnaturally across the walls of the cottage. The pup whimpered, ears flattening against its small head. The Omega rose immediately, scanning the darkened woods outside. Something was coming. A presence unlike any he had encountered before pressed against the edges of his senses. It was not human, not entirely. There was malice in the air, sharp and cold, the kind that could crush courage and silence even the bravest hearts. The Omega's pulse quickened. He had lived a careful life, hiding from danger, avoiding confrontation. But now, the threat was here, and he could not run, not this time. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Tall, cloaked in black, with eyes like smoldering coals. Its presence alone made the Omega's skin prickle with fear. The creature advanced silently, its gaze fixed on the pup. The Omega stepped in front of the small creature instinctively. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice trembled. "I won't let you touch him." The creature paused, regarding him curiously. Then, with a sudden movement, it lunged. The Omega tried to dodge, but it was faster, stronger, and for the first time, he realized that courage alone might not be enough to protect the pup. A flash of movement, sudden and impossible, and the Alpha King appeared. His armor gleamed in the moonlight as he stood between the Omega and the dark figure. The creature recoiled, sensing the immense power radiating from him. "You will harm no one under my protection," the king commanded, his voice cold, absolute, and terrifying. The creature hissed, retreating slightly, but its eyes burned with dark intent. The forest seemed to bend around it, shadows twisting unnaturally, whispering curses older than memory. The pup whimpered again, and the Omega's hands shook as he clutched it close. "You are not what I expected," the king said quietly, more to the creature than to the human. leave this place or face consequences beyond your understanding." The dark figure glared once more, then vanished into the trees, melting into the night like smoke. The forest settled, though an uneasy tension lingered, as if the world itself held its breath. The Omega sank to the ground, clutching the pup. Relief and fear warred within him. I thought we were done," he whispered, voice breaking. The king knelt beside him, not touching, but close enough that his presence was almost overwhelming. "The danger is not over," he said. "There are forces in this land that even I cannot control alone. You have strength, human, more than you know. But alone, you are not enough." The Omega looked up at him, confusion and fear swirling in his eyes. "Then, what do I do?" "You trust," the king said simply. "Trust in yourself, trust in others, trust in me." The words struck him deeply. Trust had always been difficult. People had disappointed him, mocked him, or ignored him. But here, in the presence of someone so powerful, the weight of those words carried not fear, but possibility. The following days were filled with lessons both subtle and dangerous. The king guided the Omega through the forest, teaching him how to sense danger, how to move quietly, how to protect not just the pup, but himself. The Omega's movements became surer, his courage steadier. Each time he succeeded, the king watched from a distance, pride hidden beneath his usual stoicism. Yet with each lesson, the king felt something he could not name, a stirring deep within his chest. It was more than fascination. It was admiration, desire perhaps, not of the kind that could be acted upon easily, but a longing for connection, for understanding, for the fragile human who had faced danger without faltering. One evening, they returned from the forest to find the cottage surrounded by a faint, unnatural glow. The pup whimpered, sensing something wrong. The Omega's heart sank as he saw faint, curling shadows reaching toward the small building. The king stepped forward, hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Stay behind me," he said, voice firm. "Whatever this is, it will not reach you or the pup." The shadows writhed like living smoke, forming shapes that twisted and hissed. Ancient curses whispered through the night, seeking to claim the weak and the vulnerable. The Omega's breath caught. He had never encountered such darkness, such intent to harm, and yet he did not flee. The king acted swiftly, his movements fluid, almost inhuman. The shadows recoiled at his presence, unable to touch him. The Omega watched, fear and awe twisting together. He had known the king was powerful, but seeing that power in action, wielded to protect something so small and fragile, made his heart ache in ways he could not name. When the shadows finally dissipated, the cottage stood intact, the pup safe in the Omega's arms. The king turned to him, his expression unreadable, yet softer than it had ever been. "You see now," he said quietly, "why you cannot face the world alone. There are forces you cannot imagine, but together, we stand a chance." The Omega nodded, swallowing hard. "Together," he repeated, the word strange and heavy on his tongue. It carried a promise he was not sure he understood yet. For the first time, the pup seemed to sense the king's presence as protective rather than threatening. It curled against the Omega's chest, eyes wide and trusting. The Omega felt a warmth spreading through him, the smallest glimmer of hope that perhaps not all power in the world was cruel, that some could protect, nurture, and care. That night, as the Omega sat by the fire, the king lingered outside the cottage, hidden in shadow. He did not intrude, did not speak, but his gaze rested on the small human and the pup. The flickering firelight illuminated the Omega's face, showing worry, exhaustion, and courage in equal measure. The king's chest tightened at the sight. He had faced armies, monsters, and curses beyond imagining. Yet nothing had stirred him like this. Nothing had made him feel the fragile pull of responsibility, the tension of wanting to protect someone not out of duty, but because his heart demanded it. A faint wind rustled the trees, carrying the scent of danger that lingered beyond the borders of the cottage. The king's eyes narrowed. He knew that this was only the beginning. The supernatural force that had attempted to strike at the pup and the Omega was far from gone. It would return, stronger, more determined, testing both the Omega's courage and the king's control. But for now, he allowed himself a quiet moment of observation. The Omega's small hands moved gently, soothing the pup, brushing its fur, murmuring words that carried all the love he had. The king's gaze softened, the first real crack in the armor he had built over centuries. And in the quiet of the night, a dangerous thought crept into his mind. This fragile human, he could change me. The Omega, oblivious to the king's watchful eyes, felt a strange peace as he held the pup close. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps the world could be kinder, that he might survive, that he might even matter. He did not know that the king had made a silent vow to protect him, to intervene whenever danger arose, and to watch over him with a devotion that could not be named aloud. But fate has its own plans. The shadows in the forest were not yet done, and the dark force that had glimpsed the Omega's life and the pup's fragility would not rest until it had claimed what it sought. The Alpha King's eyes gleamed in the darkness. The forest around the cottage seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the fragile balance between strength and vulnerability, power and care, was about to be tested again. The pup stirred, whining softly, sensing the subtle shift in the air. The Omega held it closer, instinctively protective, and somewhere in the shadows, the unseen threat stirred as well, its whispers curling around the trees like smoke, promising trials, danger, and a challenge that neither the Omega nor the king could yet foresee. The king's jaw tightened. He had fought many battles, defeated many enemies, and ruled over his kingdom with iron precision. But none of that would matter if he could not keep this fragile human and his pup safe. And so, he prepared himself, knowing that the coming days would demand every ounce of strength, wisdom, and restraint he possessed. The night stretched on, deep and full of secrets, and in its quiet, the threads of fate wound tighter, drawing the Omega and the Alpha King ever closer, binding them in ways neither could yet understand. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the forest in shades of gold and violet. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth, pine, and lingering shadows. The Omega sat outside his cottage, the pup nestled safely in his lap, eyes half closed but trusting. He hummed a quiet tune, soothing both himself and the small creature that depended entirely on him. But peace, he knew, was fragile. He had learned this the hard way. Shadows still lingered at the edges of the forest, whispers of the dark force that had tried to claim his pup, and he could feel them even now, though the morning light chased most fears away. A rustle in the leaves made him tense. The pup stirred, ears flicking. The Omega's heart beat faster, but he did not run. He had faced fear before, had carried his fragile charge through perilous forests, and had survived. He would do so again. And then he saw him, the Alpha King, stepping silently through the trees, as if the forest itself parted for him. His armor glinted in the sunlight, but it was his eyes that drew the Omega's attention. The king's gaze, so intense, so unwavering, held not only power but concern, an emotion the Omega had never expected from someone so fearsome. "You should not be out here alone," the king said, his voice carrying authority, but softened by something deeper. "I can manage," the Omega replied, though his voice lacked conviction. He had learned to be independent, but the presence of the king reminded him that some dangers could not be faced alone. The pup whined softly, shifting in his lap. The Omega looked down, brushing its fur gently. I cannot leave him," he murmured, more to himself than to the king. The king stepped closer, and the forest seemed to quiet around them. "You do not have to face the world alone," he said. "I will protect you both, but you must trust me. Trust yourself." The Omega's chest tightened. Trust was not easy for him. Life had taught him that people often hurt those they claimed to care for, that power was usually cruelty in disguise. But here, in the presence of someone who had saved him more than once, who had watched and learned his quiet strength, trust seemed possible, perhaps even necessary. Before the Omega could respond, a chilling wind swept through the clearing. Shadows twisted unnaturally, coiling like smoke around the trees. The dark force had returned, stronger, hungrier, and more determined. Its presence pressed down on them, a weight of ancient malice that made the hair on the Omega's arms stand on end. The pup yelped, sensing danger, and the Omega tightened his hold. "No," he whispered. "Not you. Not him." The Alpha King moved swiftly, placing himself between the Omega and the shadows. His sword gleamed, a flash of steel that cut through the darkness. "Stay behind me!" he commanded, every word a force of will. The shadows lunged, writhing like living smoke. Whispering curses older than memory, the forest itself seemed to react, the wind howling and the trees swaying violently. Yet the king stood firm, cutting through the darkness with precise, fluid movements. His power was overwhelming, almost inhuman, yet every strike was measured, controlled, as though he fought not only for victory, but for the fragile lives he had sworn to protect. The Omega's hands shook. He had never faced such darkness, never felt the weight of life and death pressing so heavily on him. But he did not falter. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, carrying the pup close, murmuring soft words to soothe it and himself. He realized that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. As the battle raged, the king glanced at him, a faint acknowledgement passing between them. The Omega's courage was not unnoticed. It stirred something deep within the king. A recognition that strength was not only in power or steel, but in heart, in care, in the willingness to face danger for those who could not defend themselves. Together, they pressed forward. The king's blade cut a path through the shadows, while the Omega used his knowledge of the forest, his instincts, and his quiet courage to guide the pup and himself safely. The dark force hissed, retreating slightly, but it was far from defeated. Then, in a moment of clarity, the Omega remembered the charm he had made for the pup, a small token woven from threads of hope and love. He held it aloft, its simple magic shining faintly in the morning light. The shadows recoiled, shrieking, and the forest seemed to brighten, the air lightening as if the charm carried all the courage and care the Omega had ever known. The king's eyes softened as he watched the human act. The bravery, the love, the quiet strength. It was impossible to ignore. For centuries, he had ruled with fear and power. But here, in this fragile human's heart, he saw a different kind of strength, a power that could change not only the world, but him. The shadows finally dissolved, retreating into the dark corners of the forest, leaving silence and sunlight in their wake. The Omega knelt, clutching the pup tightly, breathing heavily. Relief flooded him, but it was tempered by awe at what had just occurred. The king approached, placing a hand gently on the Omega's shoulder. Not a command, not a demand, but a quiet, steady presence. "You did well," he said. "Bravery like yours is rare. Human, I am proud." The Omega looked up, meeting the king's gaze. He saw something he had never seen before, Vulnerability beneath the armor, admiration mingled with something deeper, a longing that mirrored his own fears and hopes. I just wanted to keep him safe, he whispered. And you have, the king said, his voice softer now, almost tender. More than anyone could imagine. You have reminded me that strength is not only in power, it is in heart, in care, in the courage to face what others cannot. A quiet moment passed. The pup stirred, nuzzling against the Omega's chest, and the human laughed softly, a sound full of relief and wonder. The king watched, feeling a strange warmth in his chest, a pull toward the small human who had changed him without even knowing it. The Omega stood, holding the pup securely. He met the king's gaze steadily this time, no longer afraid, no longer uncertain. Then, we face the world together, he said. The king nodded. Together, he agreed. The forest seemed to exhale, the shadows of the past retreating before the light of courage, trust, and care. The king extended his hand, not in command, but in invitation. The Omega hesitated, then placed his small hand in the king's, a gesture that carried more meaning than words could express. It was trust, acknowledgement, and a bond forged in fire and shadow. The pup yipped softly, as if sensing the shift, and the Omega smiled. For the first time, he felt truly seen, truly protected, and truly powerful. Not in the way the world measured strength, but in the way that mattered most, through love, care, and courage. Days turned into weeks. The king and Omega worked together to secure the forest and village from lingering threats. The pup grew stronger under the Omega's care, with the king's quiet support ensuring its safety. They shared quiet moments by the fire, in the woods, and in the small clearing where the forest seemed most alive. Words were not always needed. Trust, presence, and care were enough. And in those moments, the Alpha King felt a transformation he had never imagined. Centuries of power and isolation had hardened him, yet this small human and his fragile pup had softened him, had reminded him that even the strongest hearts need connection, love, and trust. The Omega, too, changed. He had faced fear, survived darkness, and discovered strength he had never known he possessed. The king's attention, once terrifying, had become a source of support, guidance, and a quiet, unspoken companionship. They were different, yet alike, bound by courage, care, and the trials they had endured together. Finally, one evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, the king carried the pup in his strong arms, bringing it to the Omega. The human knelt, reaching out, and the king gently placed the creature in his hands. The pup looked up at both of them, safe, cherished, and loved. The king's gaze lingered on the Omega, steady and intense. "You have changed me," he said quietly, almost reverently. "You have reminded me that even kings are not complete without heart, without courage, without care." The Omega smiled softly, his eyes shining with unspoken emotion. "And you have taught me that power can protect, that strength can serve, and that even someone like me can make a difference." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of unspoken understanding between them. The forest around them seemed alive with possibility, the shadows of the past finally fading, replaced by light, hope, and the promise of a future they would face together. The pup yipped happily, curling against the Omega's chest, and the king placed a protective hand over both of them. The bonds forged in fear, courage, and care had transformed all three of them, and in that quiet, golden moment, the Alpha King understood something he had never known. True power was not the fear one commanded, nor the enemies one defeated, but the lives one protected, the hearts one touched, and the courage one nurtured. The Omega, cradling the pup, looked up at the king. Together, he whispered again. The king nodded. Together, he echoed. And for the first time in centuries, he felt complete, not through conquest or rule, but through love, trust, and redemption. The forest held its breath, then exhaled in the soft wind, carrying away the shadows and leaving light, hope, and the quiet echo of courage. The Alpha King, the human Omega, and the small, fragile pup had survived the darkness. They had changed each other, and the world, vast and wild, seemed a little kinder for it.